Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 7th of May and we have a lot of very important news to get to. And the most obvious news is the fact that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, has announced that Wagner has basically signed a new agreement with the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. And in this agreement, and this is all according to Prigozhin, by the way, according to his own statements, I have not found any statements from the Russian Ministry of Defense talking about this. Neither have I found any statements from Sergei Surovikin that can be 100% confirmed. I did see one statement from him, but I'm not even going to really bring it up because I couldn't find enough sources to back it up, so it might have just been faked, I'm not sure. And so what Prigozhin is alleging has been agreed upon by the Wagner Group and the Russian Ministry of Defense is that Wagner will get all of the necessary arms and all the necessary artillery shells that it needs from the MoD stockpiles, and that they will get even more than that as well. And then that the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Russian regular army will protect the flanks of Bakhmut to basically a brim, because in the videos that have been previously released by the Wagner Group and by Prigozhin, he has complained, Yevgeny Prigozhin, of the fact that the Russians and the Russian regular army have not really been providing him and with enough support on the flanks. So there are not enough VDV troops, enough motorized infantry regiments on these flanks to the north and to the south that are trying to hold and prevent a Ukrainian counterattack. That's at least what Prigozhin was alleging. So now, according to Prigozhin, the Russians are saying that they will try to settle this matter. And in addition, the Russian Ministry of Defense says that it will give Prigozhin total tactical freedom on the entire Bakhmut front, which is very interesting because the dynamic has shifted so much from the beginning of the war. In the beginning of the war, Wagner was called by the Russian Ministry of Defense to fulfill its duties, and they obeyed this request, and they fulfilled orders from the Ministry of Defense, from the Chief of General Staff, to take over certain cities like Popasnaya, Lysychansk, and then Bakhmut. But as the war has really progressed, and as the Ministry of Defense has lost a lot of its standing with the eyes of, first of all, the Russian people, but also within the Wagner Group itself, the Wagner Group has been becoming more and more autonomous, and they've been less likely to heed orders and commands from them. So it seems like this agreement between the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Wagner Group is a very desperate attempt by the Russian Ministry of Defense to try to prevent a breakdown of the offensive in this direction. And so this is very, very interesting. In addition, Prigozhin also announced in the video that Sergei Surovikin, who I remember for several months was actually the head of the SMO, the Russian operations in Ukraine, before being demoted to deputy. So currently the head of the SMO is the Chief of General Staff of the Russian Federation, and that is Valery Gerasimov. And so Prigozhin says that Surovikin will be the liaison between Wagner and the Russian Ministry of Defense. This is interesting because Prigozhin also praised Sergei Surovikin in the video, saying that he's really the only Russian general who knows how to do war. And so I think this is probably because when Surovikin was the head of the SMO, that's when basically Prigozhin got the green light to conduct his meat grinder operation in Bakhmut. According to Prigozhin, the meat grinder operation really began in October, and that's the same time that you had Sergei Surovikin become the head of the SMO, and that's when you saw all of these gains occur in Bakhmut in this circled area. And so this means that Wagner is here to stay in Bakhmut. They will continue, and they have been continuing, and I'm going to get to that, with the offensive operations against Ukrainian defenses within Bakhmut. And so for now, it seems like the crisis has been averted. Now, something that I'm wondering about is what this means will happen to the Chechen forces that Ramzan Kadyrov promised would be sent to Bakhmut to replace the Wagner forces, because basically the same day that Prigozhin released his video saying that Wagner would withdraw, which was on May 5th, Kadyrov released a statement saying that Akhmat's special forces would be sent into the city to take over their role. And so will they still go now that Wagner's still going to be conducting operations in Bakhmut, or will they still be sent to the Bakhmut front in order to supplement the Wagner forces and finally clear up and take over the city 100%? That's an interesting question, and I do expect the Chechens to be sent to the front line simply because they haven't been in action for so long, so they've been given ample amount of time to recuperate and replenish, so now they're ready for battle anyway. So this means that the Ahmad Special Forces from the 141st Special Motorized Regiment will be entering Bakhmut in the coming days and weeks, and at least 12,000 men are a part of this unit, although there could be more since the beginning of the war. Obviously, there have been casualties, but this has been really nulled by the fact that there have been a lot of new volunteers that have been added to the Chechen ranks. Additionally, Ramzan Kadyrov in June of 2022, he announced the formation of 4 new battalions of 100% ethnic Chechens that would be sent to the front lines. And so I don't know the progress with those 4 battalions, but if anything came to fruition with that, then those units could be sent now to the front line. So that's 4 extra battalions. And with this new aid from the Chechens, and with the renewed resolve of the Wagner Group, which will also be aided by additional Russian support on the flanks and additional Russian support via arms shipments, we will now see how the Russian forces in this area are preparing to finally take over the rest of the city of Bakhmut. And even while Prigozhin was basically starting this drama with the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Wagner Group was still working on the front line, conducting offensive operations and very hard artillery strikes. And so again, what we're seeing is that the Russian strategy is to attack the northwestern corner of Bakhmut. This is really the weakest point on the Ukrainian front. And so what the Russians are trying to do is to take over this entire district, cut off some of the supply lines over here, because you can see there are some key road junctions that I'm going to circle. And these are the road junctions that lead into the citadel, into this very highly defended area where you have the most Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut are in this area, and they're highly concentrated. They've been mining this area for a very long time. And again, they're not even just using the roads. A lot of these roads, they're pretty narrow. They're not even the best. Some of them aren't even paved. A lot of them are just gravel roads. So they're not in the best state right now, especially after being shelled for months upon months. So since mud season is basically over at this point, a lot of the Ukrainian forces are now relying on the open fields. So you could see there's a lot of open fields in this area, spanning from Kromove to all the way over here in this this entire open area that I'm circling. Ukrainians are moving cars, just like regular civilian cars. They're moving smaller infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers through this area. There's even like T-64 tanks that are still present within Bakhmut fighting against Russian tanks. And so we know that they're traversing through these open fields. There's actually a video that I have somewhere of that. If I can find it, I'll show it in the video. But it is pretty interesting because this means that the entire idea that Russia could just wait on the flanks and not completely cut off the Ukrainian groupings in Bakhmut and just rain down heavy artillery fire onto troops that are coming in and out of Bakhmut, it's sort of simplistic because a lot of the Ukrainian forces that are coming in and out of Bakhmut, they're coming in and out with less casualties than you would have expected. Because if the strategy of just waiting on the flanks and firing on the Ukrainian troops would have worked, then we would have seen much more significant casualties. We probably would have seen the Ukrainians abandon the citadel already, because by then they would not be able to effectively supply it, and then the Russians could just close in physically. But they haven't been doing that yet because Ukraine is putting up stiff resistance on the flanks and on the front line, which is preventing any Russian gains. And we also know that, again, the flanks, they don't have that many forces in the first place because the main push is coming from the city itself. Because the Wagner's concentrating their forces over there, they don't have enough wherewithal to also focus on the flanks, which is why they tried to relegate that job to the Russian Ministry of Defense, which is a big part of this conflict, because Prigozhin was saying that the Russian Ministry of Defense was not effectively holding the line over there, which could present an opportunity for the Ukrainians to counterattack. But it is very important to close this entire open area, this entire open field physically, because even if you have fire control over the roads, again, the Ukrainians can still just use the open fields and cross over. And sure, there's going to be artillery fire, but again, it's not 100% accurate, and these cars are going at high speeds, and the area that's to traverse is not that long, and so they have probably higher chances of surviving and making it to their destination. And so again, let's just look at the router strategy again. So throughout the past 2 days, the Wagner Group has continued to be working on Ukrainian positions within the city. There's been very significant artillery fire, and we also saw in recent days that the Wagner Group actually hired the butcher of Mariupol. If you remember this guy, his name's Mikhail Mishchev. He was fired by Putin, and he was originally the deputy of war logistics for the entire special military operation. So that's a very high position, but after 7 months of service in that position, he was fired by Putin. And subsequently, this only happened a few days ago, he was hired by the Wagner Group to be their first deputy commander. And so I think this hints at the fact that the Wagner Group really did have an issue with logistics, and that's why they were hiring this guy who just had experience with dealing with the logistics of the entire Russian army for their specific private military corporation. He had a lot of experience with how the supply lines work and how to send arms shipments, and that again is further proof to me that the concerns of Prigozhin are not just a psyop, but that he actually had legitimate concerns that he felt had to be addressed. And so that's why he hired this individual. Now, in terms of the shelling, we've seen, according to NASA firms, and I really hate using NASA firms because, again, it's so broad, and I think it's also simplistic. It's not showing every single piece of smoke that there is. And again, the fires are changing very quickly. It may have spread, it may have dissipated, we don't know. It's just a very general idea of where the fires are occurring. So don't take it as sort of gospel, whatever is shown on this map. Because again, I really don't like NASA firms, but you could get a general idea from what they're showing over here. You can see, first of all, there's a fire block within the northwestern district, and this is where the front line is right now, around this area. That indicates that, again, the Russians are shelling this area pretty heavily, trying to dislodge the Ukrainian fortified positions within this less urban area. Then, again, you have fires not within the citadel itself, but a bit to the east of it. This is an area where you still have some Ukrainian forces, and so it makes sense that there would be some artillery fire in that area. Also, it's possible that there's some Ukrainian counter battery or artillery fire of their own in some cases, which is targeting these areas. There's also a lot of Ukrainian artillery, which is targeting the downtown area of Bakhmut, near the Bakhmutovka River. So the question is, why would they be shelling this specific concentrated area? The reason that I believe is that we do know, as we talked before, that there's a possibility of the Chechens beginning to make their way to Bakhmut. And if they do make their way to Bakhmut, they're probably going to set up their rear bases in the city center, in this downtown area. There's also a lot of roads that lead to here, like this road that leads from eastern Bakhmut across the river into the city center, from the south as well, from Pitny into Bakhmut city center. There's a bunch of roads that lead to this area, and there's a lot of major facilities that could be used to store weapons and store, command posts and whatever. And so now that you're going to have thousands of new Chechens being moved into this area, I think a lot of them are going to congregate around this area. And so that may have already started being set up. And so I think that the Ukrainians, they have caught wind of this, and they're beginning to shell this area specifically in order to prevent, this formation from entering the city unified and then being sent directly to the front line to eliminate them. And so that's at least what I'm thinking from this. Now, the reason why it's taking so long for the Russians to dislodge the Ukrainians from their positions in the northwest, because honestly, you would have expected them to take it over already, because it's not a dense area particularly. It's one of the least dense areas within Bakhmut, and they actually had pretty significant success in taking over similarly spread out areas a bit to the north as well, like this entire area over here. They took over these districts pretty quickly without much fighting. And also took a lot of the districts in southern Bakhmut that had, less of a dense setting, that were just like private residences with gardens. Took those over pretty quickly as well. So then the question is, why is it taking longer for the Russians in this northwestern corner? Well, the reason is that this is really the last thing. This is the vanguard before the Citadel fortress gets isolated. So that's one thing. Also, it's the fact that, again, the Ukrainians on the flanks, they have a lot of favorable positions. So, for instance, to the south, you can't really attack the northwestern corner because the Citadel itself is located there. You can't really attack the north because Kromove is located there. Kromove is on a bit of high ground, and so it's a good area for mortars and artillery. It's a good area for firing upon the Russian forces that are fighting within the valley in the northwestern corner, which is also a big reason why Wagner has been suffering a lot of casualties this month in May. And there's also a lot of trenches that have been set up by the Ukrainians along the front line, along some of these bush lines, tree lines, whatever. And those are preventing the Russians from making an advance from the north along Kromove. And so the only way to take over the northwestern corner is by attacking it directly. And again, Ukraine has been fortifying this area for a very long time. Each house probably mined if it's not flattened. And if it's flattened, then that means there's an area for Ukraine to set up a trench as well. So again, that just means that they can drag out the fighting for as long as possible through each block, and obviously that takes a lot of resources. It also takes a lot of shells because they're already rationing shells, but they have to stop rationing shells in order to fire them en masse onto the advancing Wagner forces. So Ukraine's going to have their own issues with shell shortages that we haven't even talked about as much as the Russian shortages. And even after Ukraine withdraws from its forward positions, they have probably one last defensive line, and that defensive line is over here. If you could see on Google Maps, there's this outline of a bunch of garages, and they're very tightly packed, and they sort of create this line from the north of the northwestern corner to the south of it. And so this area could potentially be Ukraine's last defensive line in the northwestern corner because, again, it's a pretty dense area with some good fortified positions that could be utilized by Ukrainians for defense. And so I could expect them to retreat to there if they see it fit and then try to make a last stand there before they have to abandon the northwestern corner. But yeah, that's the situation on the front lines. Now again, I want to talk about the shelling in Bakhmut because, again, in the videos that we're seeing, and I have them linked by the way, let me see here. Yeah, so the destruction of the Citadel fortress. You can see this video on your own. I'm not going to show it, but it's crazy because you have a lot of these huge strikes with these incendiary 122 millimeter Grad 9M22S munitions. So these rockets, they're fired from BM-21 Grad trucks. They can have chemical, incendiary, smoke submunitions, and then those incendiary elements within the rocket itself, they have about a 2-minute burning time. So that gives a lot of time for it to target humans, to target, of course, flammable objects. But it's important to remember that they are unguided, and so you have to fire a lot of them in a sort of concentrated area in order to produce at least some sort of result. And it's also important to remember that, again, whenever these munitions are fired, like they were fired in Vuhledar, the Ukrainian forces, they usually retreat to the basements or the lower floors of these high-rise buildings in order to avoid being hit. And usually that's effective, so I don't know how many Ukrainian forces have actually died from this. And I can't really do the numbers on the cost-benefit analysis. Of course, with the videos that we saw are crazy. It's just these incendiary munitions being rained down on the entire city at night. It's some crazy scenes. And of course, if you do have a Ukrainian garrison or Ukrainian troops that are stationed on the roof of a building or on the higher floors, then yeah, they are more likely to be targeted by the incendiary munitions and get hit. So there is still damages in that regard. Also, we have this video here of Ukrainians demolishing the first buildings in the Tremba district. And so these are the buildings that are closest to the front line, you can see. And so they've already made the decision that they're so close to the front line that they might as well just abandon them already, retreat to more fortified areas, and not give Russia the opportunity to take it over and use it for themselves. And so they're beginning to destroy these apartments on their own. I don't know how many explosives they have and whether they have enough supply to destroy every single high-rise in this area because there's so many. But it seems like they're trying to do that right now. Okay. So sort of as an addendum to the entire MoD Wagner conflict, I want to again say that there do remain tensions between the Russian Ministry of Defense and Wagner. I really don't think that this was coordinated between the two of them beforehand, this entire drama. I do genuinely think that Prigozhin had his concerns with supply, and I think that's evident by the fact that there have been there's been less of a daily output of Russian shells being fired on the front in recent months. There's also the fact that there were a lot of Wagner casualties in the northwestern corner over the past week. So all of that I think is legitimate, and I think that Prigozhin actually felt that and that he voiced his concerns. So I don't think that was just a psyop. But it also seems like even if this wasn't planned beforehand, this entire idea of like a psyop to lure the Ukrainians further into Bakhmut in order to have them decimated, I think that either way, the Wagner group may have to be rotated out of Bakhmut at some point in the near future, because they have been fighting in here for really like 9 months at this point, maybe even more, in this entire area, non-stop without any sort of operational pause. And so a lot of those men, they are extremely tired. A lot of the officers probably tired, and the top brass, of course. And so they may have to be rotated out at some points to be given some time to rest and recuperate. And then that could open the possibility for the Chechen forces to be moved in and completely take over the sector for a certain period of time before the Wagner group rejoins the front line. Now, before we end the video, let's talk about some additional reports from the front, because I haven't really been focusing on Bakhmut over the past few days, and I haven't really been talking about the other fronts. Spirny, according to Ukrainian sources, there are reports that Russia has been assaulting this area for the past 3 days. Again, a key Ukrainian defensive node on the Donetsk-Luhansk border. According to Ukrainian sources, of course, take it with a grain of salt. They have pushed back every single one of these attacks, and that in the latest attack on Spirny, the Russians, they suffered a loss of 1 BMP and 1 BTR, and that 1 T-90 was damaged. And in addition, we actually did see Russians gain a bit further to the north. They were able to take over some positions around Bilohorivka. Again, another key Ukrainian defensive node along the Donetsk-Luhansk border. So to the north, the Russians made some gains on the northern outskirts of the town, and then to the south, the Russians pushed towards this water treatment facility, which is again a key Ukrainian defensive fortification. So we'll see if they take it over. It is necessary to take over this facility before actually entering Bilohorivka itself. So we'll see what goes on over there. Now, there were some airstrikes that just happened a few hours ago on Ukraine. A lot of those coming specifically from the Black Sea. So, for instance, there were 7 Tu-22 M3s that were airborne over the Black Sea in the past few hours. Seems like they struck some targets in southern and central Ukraine, although specifics are hard to get by. There was at least one Kh-22 anti-ship missile, which was launched by the Black Sea fleet at Odessa. And so, according to Ukrainian sources, actually, and they showed images, there was one warehouse. I'm pretty sure it had like some sort of logistical significance, or it stored ammo, something of the sort. And so that was totally destroyed. Additionally, there was a strike on the Zatoka bridge over here. So if you remember, this bridge has been struck numerous times by the Russians. I think that it was rendered inoperable, but it wasn't actually totally destroyed. But it seems like this time it was actually fully destroyed, at least according to preliminary reports. I haven't seen specific footage of the bridge itself. I just saw fires in the videos, so it's possible that it's still standing, but I heard that it actually has been destroyed this time once and for all. This is after numerous attempts, starting really from the beginning of the war. There was even an attempt at some point to utilize an underwater explosive drone to destroy this bridge, which didn't work out, but it seems like this time it did. So this bridge is important because, again, it connects to a larger highway that supplies the Ukrainian forces in the south. And again, this road, it actually links up with the border in, I think it is Romania, yeah. Links up through Izmail, through some other cities into Romania. And again, that's where all the NATO equipment is coming in from. And from there, you can go to Odessa, to Mykolaiv, Kherson, wherever you want. So it is a very important bridge, and taking it out is a key choke point. But it's true that Ukraine is able to also get their supplies through Moldova. It's true that Moldova is not a part of NATO, but there's some agreement where Moldova allows the shipments of weapons to be really transported across from their borders into Ukraine. Obviously not from Transnistria. It would have to occur a bit further to the north, around like Yampil or whatever, one of these towns. There's a few roads that cross through across the Dniester River from Moldova into Ukraine. So that's the situation there. Thank you guys for watching, by the way, and I'll